Very excited everyone has joined us. For people who joined the ATAP members meeting yesterday, our Program and Development Committee is very excited for the 2023 content calendar we've put together. Our committee's worked very hard to pull amazing guests like John together. Every month, we're going to have a great speaker who comes in and shares different insights with us. And then 2 weeks later, we'll come back for a roundtable session that I'll be hosting, where we'll talk about what we learned from John and what happens in your own professions and your own organizations. And it'll be a great chance to collaborate. Everyone in ATAP is very like-minded, which I love. I love building the community and learning together and growing together. So John, thank you for being our premier guest and launching this 2023 content calendar.
Thank you so much, Krista, for having me. In ATAP, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the inaugural journey with you. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive in so we can maximize our time. We will leave time at the end, everyone. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. John and I will scroll back through at the end and see if there's any questions you have that we can answer, but we will get started with the most important question. What is a diverse employer EVP, John?
Yes, it's a great question. So it's a relatively new concept. If we just take the traditional concept of employer brand or EVP, so employee value proposition are the set of promises or give and get that companies offer to candidates and employees, what they can expect in return. And essentially an EVP is a reflection of your culture as lived by employees. And then the EVP is a framework or a foundational framework that then supports an employer brand. So the brand becomes the articulation of your culture as an organization or the value that you offer in an employment environment to prospective candidates and existing employees that would appeal to those who you're seeking to attract, engage, and retain. So when you throw a diverse lens on this, and a lot of times historically, companies would build an employer brand and then slap on DE&I at the end by putting up, various images of diverse, people on their career site or in their content across their social and digital platforms and marketing collateral. But it didn't really speak to the reality of what the culture is like for people from marginalized backgrounds. And so me being somebody who built global employer brands in the pharma and biotech space, I saw the disconnect between diversity, equity, and inclusion as a function and employer brand as a practice. So that's when I started to think about how could those two worlds be bridged, and then started creating diverse employee value propositions and employer brand and diverse recruitment marketing strategies as a result.
Okay. Something that is so important, and you and I talked about this in one of our prep calls. I've worked in institutions where they've taken down my marketing campaign and they've said, no, use this stock image instead because we want to look diverse. And it doesn't sit well with me. It doesn't sit well with anyone, and it should not sit well with anyone. So I think what it said in the promo of how can we make sure that our marketing is actually matching our culture. You believe in learning what our lived experiences of the marginalized people who work in our organizations already. So talk to us about that. Where do you start? How do you learn what the lived experiences are, and why is it important that we do that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think lived experience is the pathway to developing an authentic and culturally accurate and appropriate EVP and employer brand. And so, what the framework really centers on is starting by working backwards from the marginalized experience to then develop your brand, because at that point you will now factor in how people from marginalized backgrounds are experiencing your culture, and it will help you to identify where your opportunities obviously for culture improvement are, but it'll also help you stay away from leaning into things that aren't necessarily true. right? And so the reality today is that candidates can see through fluff. They can call BS pretty quick on whether it's just performative DEI. There's too many sources, right? Network, social sites, whatever, that they can poke holes through what you're putting forth in your marketing versus what people are actually experiencing. And so the approach that I developed to really quantify this is I developed a survey instrument called the Lived Experience Survey that was designed with the most marginalized corporate experience in mind, which is Black women, and building a validated instrument that asks questions that are very unique to the marginalized experience. And so what you get with that now is the ability to quantify lived experience for essentially marginalized folks who are around gender, race, ethnicity, ability, and sexual orientation, right? Or disability and sexual orientation. And so this now creates a better conversation about who you are versus who you think you are as an organization, and then who you are as experienced by these groups of people that you're seeking to attract. And now we can have a better conversation around what could we put forth as the marketable, attractive, appealing aspects of your culture that would seek to bring in people from marginalized backgrounds in a more honest way.
Now, I think a question that a lot of us will have, and I've lived in those experiences as well with those organizations, what do we do if we stop and we look and we evaluate and we put on those, we take on those hard truths and we realize that our organizations are not diverse and inclusive? Where do you start? That can seem like a really daunting thing. And you talked a lot about how DEI is often on the chopping block first. When budgets are getting cut, there's less people, the jobs don't stop. Where do we start?
Yeah, well, most companies already know they're not diverse, so that's a good thing, right? There's nobody's thinking they are, and then they go through the survey. We do EVP research and interviews and focus groups and all these things, and they're like, "Wait, you mean we're not diverse?" I haven't had that happen yet. However,
that's good.
What I find a lot of times is that companies want to get right to the result without necessarily thinking about the work and who it's designed to impact. So one of the first questions I ask any executive, CHRO, CEO, chief talent officer, whatever, who's seeking to increase numerical representation in their organization, the first question I ask is, obviously, is your culture diverse and inclusive? High level surface question. Sure. Okay, that's easy. Okay, cool. Do you have a DEI function dedicated? And if the answer is yes, awesome. Who are the intended beneficiaries of the work of that function, right? And this now becomes a different conversation, because now we're not working from what value do we seek to extract as an organization for the benefit of the organization first. Let's think about the people that we want to make a positive impact on, so that they would have no issue being an employer brand ambassador in their networks, in their communities, and places where we don't have access. So it kind of flips it on its head, and it works backwards from the marginalized experience and what they need, versus starting at the top and what does the business need, and then trying to fit pieces around that. And it's counterintuitive for a lot of folks. You can't do this without a budget. So, to your point about if DEI is on the chopping block, which a lot of times it is, because HR functions, which DEI usually rolls into, aren't a revenue generating function of a business. And so when economic pressures kick in, when budgets are being determined based on sales and all these other external pressures, business 101 is reduce spending on things that don't generate revenue, and I get that. But you also have to then balance your expectations about what the outcomes are going to be if you don't fund them, right? And you wouldn't ask sales, marketing, R&D, or any other revenue generating or potentially revenue generating function of your business to reduce spend where it's critical, and then expect the same outcomes, right? You still have to adjust expectation.
Right. I think that's probably something we all encounter in one way, that recruitment and retention often don't go hand in hand as they should. And DEI is a big part of that. If we don't invest in the people to keep them, then we're going to recruit until we're blue in the face. And I'm sure all of us have been drowning under a large amount of requisitions. I won't even tell people the amount of requisitions I hit at the peak of the pandemic working in the hospital, because I think everyone will cry for me. But we can keep recruiting until we're blue in the face, but without retention and focus on this, we're going to keep recruiting, and it's a problem. I want to go back to what you said about people quickly identify the BS now, because you're right. What are the downfalls to being fake about it and not being forthcoming about it and not prioritizing this? What are some other downfalls that businesses will encounter if they're not having these honest conversations?
Well, first and foremost, if you've developed an employee value proposition, if you have an employer brand, not centering the reality versus the balancing the reality and the marketing, you're actually working against your employer brand. And how are you doing that? Well, okay, you can attract the talent, you can hire the talent. The question is, are they going to stay beyond 6, 8, 12 months? And a lot of the attrition is happening in that first year, right? Or even in the first 24 months or 18 to 24 months. So imagine you spent a significant amount of money in attracting this talent, right? Whether you invested in employer brand marketing and so forth, recruitment marketing and so forth. You get them, you hire them, the environment is not psychologically safe, it's not inclusive, certainly not equitable, and it's lacking in diversity above a certain leadership level. These these groups of talent are examining all of that, and oh, by the way, what shapes your direct daily lived experience at an organization? It's your manager. So middle managers tend not to be the ones on board with the DEI initiatives, really ensuring that they're embraced, lived, and experienced. And so this all then lends itself to a terrible lived experience with your company. So all of the money that you spend in attraction, sourcing, going to events and conferences, and all of this investment in attracting the talent has now just gone out the window with the attrition rate. And by the way, these people don't keep their experience to themselves, right? Most people don't. They're going to have something to say in a public forum, more or less, or even in private, it doesn't matter. But now your brand, your employer brand, is being tarnished because of your lack of investment in retention and improving lived experience. So that's really the way that I approach this, and that we at Shaker approaches this. Okay, you can spend a lot on attraction, and we can do all of that, but we also want to make sure that who you attract, you actually retain, and that not only that you retain, that they're positioned to be your biggest employer brand ambassadors, right? Because then that helps the employer brand work for itself. And so we look at ways that you can reduce attrition, that number one, reduce the need to go and hire, but then also create natural and organic networks of employer brand ambassadorship that attract talent on its own.
Okay. Now let's go back to budgets. I'm going to keep you circling around. I'm going to go back and forth. Let's talk about budgets, because you posted on LinkedIn the other day, a great TikTok you did about, well, how can we be creative with the budgets and where else could they be? What can we do instead of just letting it be on the chopping block and saying, well, they said it's gone, it's gone. How can we be creative about it? How can we advocate for keeping those budgets or shift the budgets around?
Well, one way that I've seen, is from an employer brand perspective, different functions of the business that have the greatest hiring need tend to have bigger budgets as well, right? And so if everybody's taking a haircut, I get that. But sales, marketing, operations, manufacturing, R&D, depending on your space, they're going to have budget to recruit, and they're going to need people to fulfill the functions to meet the company's objectives. So this is where I see people, from the talent acquisition function partnering, having strong relationships with their functional partners to allocate budget towards employer branding efforts or recruitment marketing efforts specific to the talent that they need to attract. And if that is, if these functions have if they're focused on attracting diverse groups of talent, then they should be able to allocate certain budget towards these efforts, right? And that's where you start to partner and get funding from other areas of the business if you're not going to get it directly into HR or into TA. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Offices typically aren't flush with cash either. So again, it's a partnership model. What I propose is also thinking about where the funding's coming from, dedicated funding is coming from, like a CEO's discretionary budget, which a lot of them have, the sales and marketing budget, a portion is allocated directly to DEI to help fund these efforts as well. But when it comes to recruitment and talent attraction, I think a lot of times it's partnering with the business functions.
Okay, great. Now, we told everybody you were going to share 2 words that people can focus on to make sure that their employer brand is truly inclusive and diverse. Yeah. I know I'm on the edge of my seat. I don't even know what those 2 words are yet. So talk to us about what those 2 words are.
Well, I've spoiled it, actually. The answer is lived experience, right? If you're building an employer brand specific, so let me say this, a lot of times companies would build employer brands around the majority, right? The majority of their employee experiences, and that would become the expression externally. And that's why you were getting people, sort of bolting on DEI at the back end, because it wasn't factored in from the get-go. What I'm suggesting is the approach has to work backwards from the lived experience of your employees and all of your employees to truly be an accurate reflection of your culture. Otherwise, you're selling a projection of what you think your culture is versus what it actually is. And then there's a disconnect between candidate experience and employee experience. And that then leads to people leaving and everything else we've talked about. So the lived experience and really getting into quantify and understand that holistically and quantitatively and qualitatively is the best way to now have honest conversations about who you are not, who you'd like to become, and what you need to bridge those gaps.
And I think sometimes that honesty is tough, right? Especially when it comes from the leadership. We know a lot of organizations are top down. We know that the day-to-day is shaped and formed by our leadership. So that can be daunting. How do you typically encourage people to persevere through it when you're facing people who don't want to change? Because it's a fact of life. It's a sad fact of life that people are very resistant to change. So how do you encourage people to persevere through it?
Yeah. Well, Caroline Wanga, who is a brilliant mind, the CEO of Essence magazine, formerly Chief Diversity Officer at Target, she did a talk a few years ago, and she said something that stuck with me, and it was profound. She says, if who you are doesn't fit where you are, change where you are, not who you are, right? Ooh, and so I don't encourage people to try and change these organizations that are unwilling and have no desire or even motivation to change. That's an exercise in futility and frustration and probably physical or heart condition. So, it's so I would say also be very aware of what's working for you and what's not. And seeking other opportunities where you do have an opportunity to impact change. But if you really believe in where you are, if you think change is possible, well, then you have to find the people who are going to be supportive. And it might not be the executive leadership directly, right? You might need people that are in position adjacent to or reporting to, or people that are influential enough to make decisions at certain levels to try and pilot certain things to then prove the cases. But it's not an easy task by any stretch to try and get everybody in the executive leadership team to be on board, because that doesn't work in any instance of reality in society, right? Not everybody's going to be aligned. You've got competing priorities, competing pressures, budgets, demands, deliverables, and all of these things. And so you have to find where people have the energy behind this change that can support some of the ideas that you're bringing to the table.
And I think people are afraid to fail, right? They're afraid to launch initiatives because they're afraid it's going to fail. But I'm of the mentality that if we don't try, we'll never know what works and what doesn't. And if it doesn't work, then you can shift it around and try again. But I think a lot of people are afraid to start because they're afraid that something's going to fail. It's daunting.
It's a great statement. And I think the reality is there's not a lot of cultures that bake in failure as a necessary part of growth, right? And there's not a lot of places in society that actually support that concept either, right? We're taught K through 12 that you have to get the answer right. And if you get it wrong, then you're a failure. And if you don't get A's, then you get D's, right? So it's kind of baked in sociologically. It is counterintuitive, especially when you're talking about other people's money, that being at a company that you want to try something in, to take that kind of risk. And it's not necessarily like a financial aspect only. It's also people's reputation, right? Who in executive leadership is willing to be bold when they don't necessarily have to be, right? And once you reach a certain level in a company, your job isn't necessarily to go and break the system to make all these new and creative things, unless your job is innovation, right? Most people in executive positions are really thinking about, okay, well, how do I keep status quo and keep this machine running so that I don't draw too much negative attention and keep the bonus coming and all of these things. Let's be honest, right? So change and disruption and bold ideas are the antithesis of status quo, which most people aren't really into on a day-to-day basis. So, this is a risk for a lot of people in their mind.
It is. Something I'm noticing more, and I've been recruiting for a long time, and I know a lot of people in this call have as well. Something I'm being asked more, and I talk to recruiters all day, every day, and they're saying the same thing. Candidates are asking, even as early as the screening call, what is the DEI initiatives that your company has? What are the policies that are in place? What do you think has driven this change? Why do you think more candidates are comfortable asking this up front now? I have my own theories, but I'd love to hear from you. Why are they more bold to ask that?
Well, most people today don't want to walk into a burning building, right? So if I can ask you up front, what is your culture really like? I saw what you put on the career site. Your LinkedIn posts are great. They look good. I'm getting all the emotional heartstrings pulled. Awesome. But what is it really like, right? What is your commitment to DEI? That's one question. But then what are the actions you're taking against the commitment? And this is an opportunity to sniff out BS, right? Because there's the canned response that the recruiters were handed and say this, but then there's the real response. So if I were able to speak to somebody in the ERGs, right, the employee resource groups directly, and there are companies who are setting those kinds of meetings up in the candidate candidate journey, right? So after screening, pick which ERG you want to speak to, and we'll set up time for you to have a real conversation with them, and you can ask anything you want. That is a bold approach, right? Because now it's not me as the recruiter whose job is to sell you on the idea of working here. Now I'm going to talk to somebody who lives it every day, that actually has a reflection of my cultural identity, my experiences, and so forth, right? My religious beliefs, whatever. And now I can ask one-to-one on an honest basis without, an objective person, ideally. What is it like? What am I going to experience? If you had to do it all over again, would you still make the same choice? And now you're going to have some better calculus in your decision making, right? And that's ultimately what candidates want to know up front, because I'm about to invest my time into your organization. I want to make sure that I can do that in a way where I'm psychologically safe and that I know what I'm getting before I walk in. And of course, nobody's going to crystal ball it and predict your future.
Right.
You want to remove as many red flags as possible up front, right? Otherwise, you're back in the market hunting again.
Right. I tell every candidate I talk to, I'm probably the most honest recruiter you'll ever talk to, but I think a lot more people are like me in that they're encouraging candidates to ask those tough questions and to ensure it's the right decision for them, because we've all been there, I'm sure yourself included, where you get to the 11th hour and the candidate declines the offer and then you start over, right? It's even worse, I think, when you get the person in the door and within that 30, 60, 90-day check-in, they're back out the door and you have to start over. And then you have to explain to people why you're starting over. So I think that's a great idea about getting them to connect with the ERGs and to hear specifically from people. Nothing beats employer brand ambassadors. Nothing will beat that. We can say whatever we want, but nothing will beat ambassadors from your organization, and I'll die on that hill. Nothing will beat it. Nothing I say will beat them talking to an ambassador from my organization. So I love that. That's a great idea.
Yeah, look, honestly, I've never been a recruiter, but in my work in employer brand and recruitment marketing, I've worked alongside. And my thing is, why wouldn't you increase or heighten your chances to land the candidate that you want by having social proof, right? Meaning bringing in other people who are independent to verify and validate the experience. That's a win for you, and it takes a little bit of pressure off you to try and sell the idea solely, right?
I think that's going to become more of a necessity as we go forward, because we have this big generation of workers coming up where they put everything on the internet. Everything they do is on the internet. So they are used to validating and researching everything, and they want to know it. And I think recruiters need to be prepared to handle that. We're often just the face of the organization. We're not the decision makers, but the more prepared we are to gently push hiring managers to be prepared to give those answers to the questions. It's not going to work anymore to give those blanketed boilerplate responses. It's not going to work. We have a major generation of workers coming up that won't accept it. And they will not pick us, and we'll be back searching in a heartbeat.
I love what you're saying there, Krista. It's real, and I think the key word there is transparency. There's been a lot of focus on authenticity over the past several years around recruitment marketing and employer brand and authentic expressions of your employer brand, and that's typically lended itself to, like, again, emotional marketing, storytelling, and spotlighting employees and so forth. And that's cool. But I think the next level of authenticity is going to be in transparency and accountability. Right? And I'm banking on that because, again, if we're talking about a generation who's grown up with digital transparency, there are no secrets, right? There's social media and the internet. They're now expecting the same level of transparency and accountability from the places that they work, right? Or that they trade time for money. And so this is a company culture shift that is very slow to be made, very uncomfortable. And again, there's also risk involved with that in some people's mind, right? Particularly legal departments. But I dare say I haven't seen a level of transparency and accountability that was honest about who they were backfire into massive class action lawsuits, right? Like, if you're saying you're openly discriminatory, yeah, you should expect that outcome of class action lawsuits. But if you're saying, look, if you're honest about it and saying, while we are committed to DEI and building more inclusive cultures, we know firsthand that we are not there. We know that, what you might see in terms of our day-to-day individual contributors might look more diverse, but then when you look at our executive leadership team, there's not a bit of diversity to be found. Being honest about that and calling it out before others have a chance to, I think, is the way forward and actually being successful in this work.
I think so too. Okay, let's shift to how we're attracting them, right? We've talked about making the changes, advocating for the changes in the budget. So let's think about the attracting. We already hinted around the doing more than just the stock photos, but job postings and how we are searching for candidates. Let's start with job postings. What can we do to make sure that our job postings are more diverse and inclusive to attract the right people?
Yeah. Well, one is to ensure that they're accessible, right? A lot of times we get caught up in certain elements of diversity, but without thinking about ability and disability. And so we need to, first and foremost, make sure that our job descriptions are accessible, ADA compliant, that you're doing videos or content with closed captioning and so forth. But once you get to your job description, there are certainly a lot of tools out there that can help you write more inclusive job descriptions. And not just in the language that you use, which there's plenty of research to showcase that certain language communicates bias towards, gender, towards, ethnicity and so forth. But also thinking about the structure of your job description, right? There's a huge move right now around skill-based hiring rather than credential or pedigree-based hiring, right? And that's another slow mover, but when we're talking about what do you actually need to be successful in this role, not where did you go to school and what degree do you have, it's a different conversation, which now opens up talent pools. It opens you up to a whole world of new talent pool opportunities. And so the job descriptions need to not only be accessible and written in a way that are inclusive, but also being more open to who should apply based on the skills that they possess, regardless of where they acquired those skills or where they got their education.
I will never forget the first time I saw a job posting that said must have a degree from an Ivy League school. And I think my jaw dropped to the ground for a solid 20 minutes. I can't even imagine something more offensive. I'm an ex-teacher. I have degrees, but I don't think my degrees form my career. And I know there's many like me who feel the same way. It's about what you can do, definitely not where you went to school. I think that is such an elitist view. And college is really expensive. University is extremely expensive. And that same generation of workers that's coming up, they're not going to have Ivy League degrees in the same amount that they did in the past. So I think that's a great point to bring up.
Yeah.
Okay. What words of advice do you have for people to avoid? You've told them what to focus on and what to do. What should people avoid when they're trying to kick off these initiatives? What do they need to make sure that they are staying away from?
I would say first, make sure that your approach is based in research, right? Not the feelings or the assumptions of people with decision-making power, right? Which I've seen more than you would know. Well, CEO thinks it should sound like this. Well, what research is backing that? No, they just think it should sound like this. So this is the message we want you to use. Okay. So I would say as much as possible, do the research, partner with organizations outside that can objectively come in and examine your culture and your processes and your strategies to ensure that you are being positioned as the employer of choice in an authentic and accurate way. But stay away from the performative as much as possible. And the performative is, again, stock imagery, or even if you're doing like photo shoots for with existing employees, cherry picking specific demographics to now put up in your marketing collateral lends itself to tokenism, right? And that does not accurately reflect the reality. So if you're pulling the one Black woman or the one Latino or the one Asian or wheelchair disabled person for a photo shoot, but that's not really a reflection at any significant degree across your organization, then you're painting a false narrative, right? And so being cognizant of that, people will, again, see through that. So stay away from the performative. And also I would say, it's okay to say, I don't know, right? I think a lot of times recruiters are tasked with bringing in this diverse groups of talent, bringing in diverse groups of talent to, through sourcing, through recruitment events, conferences, campus visits, so forth, but really aren't in touch or connected to the communities that they're trying to attract. And I'd say start there before, okay, well, I have to increase Black, Latino, and women in tech by 30% this year, but you don't have authentic or organic access to any of those communities. And so now you're going out into these communities and you're trying to sell to these communities a company experience that doesn't reflect their community, and you don't know how to engage authentically as well. So I would say stay away from selling into communities that you don't have exposure to, understanding, or some level of cultural competence or intelligence, and seek out the training.
Perfect. I'm getting an alert that my battery is at 5%, so I'm not plugged in. So I'm going to introduce the next question and turn my camera off while I check my cord. Sorry, everyone. I encourage you to start putting your questions into the chat. I'm going to ask John, tell us what Shaker does. Tell us everything that Shaker can provide, the services, how you can help organizations that maybe don't know how to start. And I'm going to get myself plugged back in here.
You got it. Yeah. So Shaker is a full service recruitment marketing agency. We do everything from employee value proposition and employer brand to DEI consulting, to creative development, social media management, and marketing. We also consult on HR tech stack. So we don't have a proprietary platform to sell you per se, but we do partner with all of the biggest names and some of the names that you've never heard of where it comes to marketing tech and HR tech, excuse me. And then from a digital capability perspective, we've built some of the world's most well-known brands' career websites and web experiences, integrating technology into those experiences, and then creating a really solid candidate experience through our digital platforms. Programmatic and social spending, or paid search engine marketing, pay-per-click, all of that, digital in-home, out-of-home advertising as well. So, and then analytics. We have an amazing analytics division that's dedicated to showcasing ROI from end to end, from attraction to hiring, assuming that your HR tech connects to each other and talks to each other, which wouldn't that be the holy grail? But in
that would be the holy grail.
It would be. But yeah, but we do have some interesting approaches that get our clients very close to being able to say, okay, this spend on this digital platform connected X amount of potentials that converted to X amount of hires, and so forth. So a lot of amazing work that we do in all aspects of recruitment, marketing, employer brand, HR tech, creative, social, and analytics. Yeah. And Shaker's a 71-year-old family-owned organization based in Chicago, Illinois, but we do global employer brands and recruitment marketing strategies. And so we have a network of partners around the world for many of our global clients who, we work with across Europe, Asia, South America, and Middle East, Africa.
And you used to be one of their clients. I think your journey is very cool how you ended up there. You used to be one of their clients. So clearly you really believe in the vision of Shaker.
Very much so. Very much so. Yes. I started out as a client where I was building the global employer brands for one of the largest pharma companies in the world. And, we did amazing work together. I always say, like, Shaker has a social media division because of me, because of the things that I was doing to bring, recruitment into social when it was still relatively new. And so Shaker created an entire division to focus on social media, which has now expanded exponentially. But yeah, it's, and then I took my relationship from one company to another, and they were my agency of record. Until one day I was like, you know what, I think there's an opportunity to bridge the gap between employer brand and DEI. Why don't I come do that? So here I am. And so as the VP of Yeah, the VP of Global Employer Brand Diversity and Culture. My remit was to build the DEI consultancy from the ground up to effectively merge the worlds of DEI and employer brand and EVP, as well as help organizations to transform their culture through some really interesting approaches like our lived experience survey and so forth.
That's great. All right, we have a couple of questions coming through in the Q&A. I know someone said the chat function is disabled, but it looks like there is a Q&A function as well. So however you want to get your questions through, we'll make sure John gets to them. So first question, what is one initiative you've implemented in an organization that you are especially proud of?
That's a good question. And I have to choose just one. Well, I'll say this.
That might be hard.
I'll say this, launching the lived experience survey, which was a completely new approach. And when, I know without a lot of context as to what's in it, I can tell you that there are questions in this survey that nobody's ever asked in your typical engagement or pulse survey, and it's very intentional. But it's groundbreaking in that sense. And so being able to deploy that into our first few clients that were brave enough to go this route, the insights and the impact have been unbelievable in terms of not only putting the numbers right in front of our executives who our executive clients, but also what they've then been able to take that to do with those insights to start to improve areas like employee relations. Something as simple as going back and looking at their employee relations policies and how they were written and who wrote them. When you look at who's disproportionately impacted and affected by these policies, or who's going to be using employee relations a lot in the context of discrimination, well, if the policies aren't written in ways that people can, number one, understand, but they aren't clear on what they can expect, what the outcomes could be, how they're going to approach this work, well, now you're disenfranchising people through a medium that's supposed to at least give them a voice or an outlet for help. And so I've seen some of our clients actually revamp and rewrite their policies to be more culturally inclusive. I've seen, executives who we've taken through unconscious bias training and debrief sessions where we dig deep into their backgrounds, their histories, their privileges, advantages, and disadvantages, really break down and understand in very different ways how their experience is largely ignored because they're the executives and people just expect them to be, from affluent backgrounds and from, the top 1% and all these things. And you find a lot of people weren't, they didn't start that way, and they don't really tap into their upbringings and the environment or the circumstances that made them who they are, that actually impact how they lead, how they make decisions for an entire organization. And doing that, I've seen people walk away with commitments to mitigate bias and hold their executive leadership team accountable in ways that we can only dream of expanding. So it's been a lot of awesome work there.
That's great. All right, next question. What are some of the key metrics that leaders ask for to measure the success of these programs?
Well, for recruitment, especially around DEI, it's going to be increased in numerical representation across specific demographics. We always recommend leveraging your own HRIS data to determine where your gaps are. But you'll see things like, increasing diverse slates by X%, increasing conversion, having diverse panels, for panelists for interviews as a metric, increasing relationships with particular universities or associations or organizations as metrics. I often say that numerical representation or increasing representation is a weak metric, right? Because it ultimately lends itself to a perverse incentive. And what I mean by that is people will do what they can to juice the numbers, but that doesn't do anything for retention, right? Or attrition. So what we introduce into the conversation is starting to leverage attrition data as a measure of success, right? Can you reduce attrition in the pockets of your organization with these diverse demographics in a meaningful way, so as to showcase the improvement of culture in these departments? And if you're going to bring people into the organization, you have examples of how you have improved culture, which ultimately lends to a really good employer brand story.
Okay. This question is also about metrics, so I'm going to read the whole thing. It's a great question from Michelle. There's been a lot of focus on metrics lately for D&I. From your perspective, what is the most vital data that you should be capturing? For example, sourcing with intent, conversation to interviews, and then hiring metrics. Also, physical representation is important, but what is the ROI that you're seeing coming strictly from this resource in the US?
Wow, great question. My response is probably going to be a bit unorthodox and uncomfortable. All of the metrics you've stated are standard and typical. I don't disagree. What I often ask is, who gets fired if this doesn't work? There's a reality that human nature, right? Human psychology, the only way behavior changes is through consequence or reward. Carrot or stick. This is still the biological human imperative. If I'm not consequentially going to feel an impact negatively, or to the converse, I'm not going to benefit or receive a reward for doing this, then why do I change? I don't have to. So the best metric is who gets fired if this doesn't work. Unfortunately, there isn't a company out there that has a consequence mechanism if DEI doesn't work. So what you tend to get is, well, how can we better measure and all this? I'm like, you can put whatever KPI, whatever metric you want. And again, if you increase numerical representation, that's great. It's a great PR story. Does it mean you've changed the culture? Does it mean that you've created more psychological safety, cultural intelligence and awareness, cultural competence? No, it just means that you brought more bodies into burning buildings. So I say, let's use better metrics. Let's put some consequence mechanisms or some reward mechanisms that can improve. So for instance, one out of the box way to think about this is, if you were to examine your attrition rates across your organization, and let's say you have a very high attrition rate in your sales division amongst Black, Latino, women, and so forth. Wouldn't it be amazing if you had an incentive for that middle management layer to get a bonus for a 10 to 20% reduction in attrition within those demographics? And let's say you tie that to the cost of hiring, right, the cost per hire that you now don't have to spend, that you can allocate towards that incentive. That would be a much more interesting approach than saying, well, I need you to increase Black, Latino, women, or disabled by 20%. Well, what happens if I don't? Well, we'll just do it next year too. Like there's just this cycle of repeating for the sake of measurement. And I also have to say that measurement isn't accountability, it's measurement, right? Accountability means that not only are you responsible, but there is something that happens or a consequence tied to it if it doesn't hit. If you as a sales leader don't hit your numbers for 3 quarters in a row, guaranteed there's a consequence for that, right?
Yeah.
Why are we looking at these things, these initiatives any different?
Perfect. All right, we have one last question. So we have about 10 minutes left. If people have other questions, drop them in now. The last question we had is, are there any certifications or resources you would recommend in helping to develop a DEI committee?
So yes, I think, well, let me take that in 2 parts. So certifications, sure, there are plenty of accredited academic institutions that are doing DEI certifications. I got mine from Yale School of Management, and I know what is it? There's a bunch, and Cornell I know has a really good program as well. Either way, there's plenty of certifications you can get. When it comes to forming DEI committees, I'm not necessarily sure about the attachment of certifications to doing that. However, when you're looking at building a committee within your organization, whether it's a DEI task force, committee or organization who's going to be centered on policy and procedure and funding around DEI, then it's best to start with your executive leadership. And to have an executive sponsor for sure, but also finding people within the organization who are not only passionate about it, but also have some level of background, education, or experience in doing DE&I work within a corporate environment. A lot of times what you get is people who are passionate about it, but haven't necessarily gone through any training, who might have done some things in the past at other organizations, but there's a lot of other factors that need to be considered in building a entity within the organization who's going to be responsible or influential in DEI work.
Great. All right, next question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Krista, I see that the chat function is now enabled, it says. So, I mean, if anybody can try a chat message as well, that'd be cool.
Yeah, Sarah fixed it for us. She's helping us with all the background stuff. Next question we have for you is, what is your advice for TA leaders in organizations where the dedicated DEI function is in its infancy, less than 2 years, and separate from TA? How can TA make sure we bridge any possible gaps between our perceived culture and our actual culture? That's a great question.
Fantastic question. Well, first and foremost, there has to be a ongoing and consistent cadence of connection between those organizations, right? It should be weekly, bi-weekly meetings to ensure that TA is aware of DEI's strategy and how TA can support that, whether it's just through recruitment, whether it's through internal culture building, whether getting recruiters into ERGs, whatever the case may be. And vice versa, DEI function needs to understand how we recruit, where we're recruiting, what is the sourcing strategy. They should be a partner in developing any EVP work and employer brand development, because again, you can infuse the DEI strategy into the EVP and employer brand expression, and vice versa. Again, the talent, I've seen TA be an amazing partner with company ERGs, right? Not only just for sourcing talent, but also for getting the employer brand messaging into the ERGs, giving people ammunition to be able to leverage as ambassadors within their networks and organizations, associations that they're part of, and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunity to connect, not just for the outcome of recruitment, but also for shaping culture and experience.
Okay, great. We have another question that's come in. As an agency recruiter, it's important to me to partner with employer clients who are prioritizing DEI. What red flags would you look for to tell if a company is simply being performative or if they genuinely want to be diverse and inclusive? Ooh, that's an awesome question.
Oh, yes, it really is. I think some of the red flags will be apparent. The conversation with leadership, okay, if you don't hear anything past we're committed to DEI, or we just hired our DEI leader, okay, they're in their infancy, right? But if they've got a mature DEI organization and you're asking questions, it's really about asking better questions. Well, what are the goals of this DEI organization? How is leadership and the leadership landscape, visual representation being prioritized, right? Because I'm looking at your leadership page on your website, on your career site, and it doesn't necessarily reflect visually your narrative statement about your commitment. So that's one way to really examine, I think, or call out some red flags. Also, get the pulse of the people. They'll tell you. I mean, one question that we've asked a lot of ERGs when we do focus groups, or even when I do speaking engagements with ERGs, if if somebody were to ask you, right, since 2020 and the summer of social injustice and George Floyd's murder and all of these DEI commitment statements that are coming from leadership in the past 3 years, have you seen a material improvement to your daily lived experience? Right. This is the one question I usually ask. Have you seen a material improvement to your daily lived experience as a person from a marginalized background? The answer 10 out of 10 times is no. That is the only red flag that you need to, right, to examine, because regardless of the amount of commitments, funding, headcount, whatever, if that work isn't impacting the people who are most marginalized, then what are we doing? And what can we change? And are you okay with that, or would you like to see that change? These are, we have to start asking better questions, right? And uncomfortable questions.
We do. Uncomfortable questions. And I think people are starting to see through the lip service, right? When companies are just saying it for the sake of saying it, and because their competitors are saying it, and because they feel it's the right thing to do, but they're not making any fundamental changes. I think people are seeing through that a lot more, and as they should, and I applaud them, and I'm excited for it, because I do believe, and I think everyone here on these calls is committed to it, I do believe that we can transform our industry, we can make it better for organizations, and we can make it better for job seekers, but we have to be uncomfortable with the hard truths. And I really thank you for everything you've shared with us today. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure. No, I absolutely enjoyed the conversation, Kristen. Thank you for the attendees who submitted questions. They were really good questions. And I'm always happy to connect further, for sure.
For sure.
I'm on LinkedIn constantly. So.
Perfect. Constantly, he says. How do people find you?
Yes, LinkedIn is where you will find me a lot. Otherwise, you can certainly reach me through the shaker.com website. And we'd be happy to have a conversation about how we can help, examine and quantify the lived experience to make a really good and authentic and accurate EVP and employer brand.
Perfect. So like I said in the beginning, in 2 weeks, we're going to have the round table. So this is always going to be the second Wednesday of the month. And then it's the fourth Thursday of the month. My math might be off. It's the first week back at school after a long winter break, so bear with me, but I think it's the fourth Thursday of the month. What is the biggest takeaway you'd like to leave with everyone here today, and people who might watch the recording in the ATAP circle later on, that we can talk about when we come back together in 2 weeks? What is the biggest takeaway for people?
Yeah.
I'm going to type it in.
That's a good one. Sorry, was that from me?
I'm just going to type it right into the chat as you're saying it, so people can remember what their takeaway is.
Yeah. Again, the biggest takeaway is, how can we work backwards from the lived experiences of those who are most marginalized in our organizations to truly improve the culture and therefore a better employer brand?
All right. How can we work backwards from the lived experiences of the marginalized populations in our organizations to truly make a difference? Did I get it right?
Yeah, well, to improve the culture and therefore making a better employer brand.
Culture and therefore making a better
Do we want to smile?
employer brand. I'm typing fast. You're testing me.
Take it back. Take it back.
Okay, perfect. Everyone, I encourage you to think about it, resonate on it for the next week or so. Connect with John. He's got great content that he shares on his LinkedIn page as well. Thanks, John, for being part of this, our flagship launch. I'm really excited for 2023 to host these sessions every month. Everyone, I will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks as well, and then we'll come back next month for another great session. Thanks again, John. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, Krista. Take care, everyone. Be well. Be safe.